Welcome to the CAPA Educational Forum on the JFK assassination. My name is David Denton. I'm a history professor at Olney Central College, and welcome to this forum. Again, I hope you enjoy it. I'm going to give you a little bit of an introduction about what could be the most controversial event in American history, the JFK assassination. And I'll try to spend a little bit of time talking about why that is the case. I think one thing we need to look at is it's kind of a unique event in American history because there seems to be some variance between what our institutions say what happened in Dallas, Texas on November 22nd, 1963 with the assassination of the president, and maybe our public opinion, which has always been in a majority towards the idea of conspiracy. Why is there this variance? And I think there's some good answers that we can come to today. I think when I look at the JFK assassination, I think in many ways it's somewhat mysterious in some ways, but in other ways maybe more so unresolved than unsolved. I think there's some things that we can look at where we can give us some strong indications of what may have happened in Dallas. I can tell you that I feel strongly the idea that what did not happen in Dallas is the idea that was brought forth after the assassination by the Warren Commission, which examined this, appointed by Lyndon Johnson, that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. And I think my reasons for that, my feelings for that are that the facts of conspiracy are just pretty evident. There are just a number of things there that can't be ignored. The idea that a whole range of witnesses who were there at Dealey Plaza that day saw that shots came from the front, or were indicated to them that shots came from the front, as opposed to the rear where Lee Harvey Oswald was supposed to be in the Texas School Book Depository on the 6th floor. And then there's the evidence that was used to basically suggest that Oswald did it. Primarily, one of the most controversial things, of course, I'm sure you probably or may be familiar with the single bullet theory. And when you look at the origins of that theory, I think you can understand why there's so much skepticism about the idea that Oswald may have acted alone or even at all. And you have to go back to the basics of that. The Warren Commission was appointed by Lyndon Johnson. They came together, and I think there's a lot of indications. I've spent time looking at the new documents that have been declassified in recent years. Other people have as well. There's a lot of indications that the Warren Commission was more about trying to satisfy the public. In fact, that is in a quote from some top people, that Oswald indeed acted alone. But again, what about the evidence? I mentioned the single bullet theory. Where did that come from? Actually, it was a theory concocted by Arlen Specter, a junior counsel. He was asked to find a way to show that somehow Oswald could have done the shots by himself and killed the president. But there's real problems with that. First of all, the Zapruder film, a home movie of the assassination, indicates, and from a time frame, depending on different opinions, anywhere from 5 to 6 seconds to 8 to 9 seconds, that 3 shots were the maximum amount that could have been taken with the Mannlicher Carcano weapon that Oswald was supposed to be using in that time frame. There were 3 spent shells found on the 6th floor. Yet, when you start to look at the number of wounds caused in that in the shots fired against Kennedy, and of course John Connally, the governor of Texas, who was sitting in the front seat, the multiple wounds that were created, 7 wounds, 2 dense bones, and you look at the time frame and the shots as they happen, it's really difficult to believe. So with the 3 shots, let's take a look. First of all, there was a man by the name of James Tague who was standing at the base of the street that day, who was hit by a bullet fragment that was obviously indicated one of the shots. That's what created a lot of problems from the Warren Commission, because that takes one shot out of play. So if you've had a chance to look at the Zapruder film, and many people have, and you should, you'll notice that the key shot, of course, was the where JFK's head was basically blown off by one shot. Now that leaves basically one shot left to create a throat wound in JFK's himself, and also multiple wounds were in John Connally was sitting in the front seat. And again, this just makes it very difficult to believe that could have happened, especially when you examine certain things like the Zapruder film itself. I mean, it seems to indicate that JFK is reacting to a wound before John Connally, and if you're going to connect the shot that went through JFK's throat with the wounds of John Connally in the front seat, why is one person reacting and the other person is not? John Connally would indicate in interviews afterwards, after the fact, that he was not hit by that same shot. So you've got that, and then of course the so-called magic bullet itself, the CE-399, which appeared to have almost nothing missing and in perfect condition, yet it hit dense bones, went through the body. And any shots taken, if anybody that knows any experience about shots and wounds, and bullets are usually badly mangled after they've created those kind of wounds. This bullet found on a stretcher in Parkland Hospital was in almost perfect condition. And so there's some things there that, I've given you some indications of things that cast doubts or more than just doubts on the Warren Commission version of history. And I just feel like there's just a number of things there that make it difficult to believe that Oswald acted alone or acted at all. For instance, people smelled gunpowder on street level. And how does that happen if the only person shooting was 6 floors up? Smoke usually goes up. It does not go down. These are all examples of, I think, of things that a series of improbabilities leads to what I would believe is impossibility. The weapon itself, the Mannlicher Carcano, was not a very efficient weapon. It was a bolt-action Mannlicher Carcano rifle that had to be recycled and took a number of seconds each time. And the history and background of Oswald himself seems to indicate that he did not have any expertise in shooting. Yet he was pulled off some shots that even the FBI's top shooters couldn't recreate afterwards. So there's a lot of things there that seems to indicate and cast doubt about this. So if we get to that point where we say, okay, well, all right, if that's not what happened, then I think what did happen, that's the more difficult thing. I think if you take the time to look at some of the evidence associated with this and realize that this just doesn't add up, that's probably the easier part. The harder part is to examine, well, how can we come to some answers about if Oswald wasn't the person who did this, who did it? The ultimate question. Who killed JFK? And I think those are good questions for all of us to try to look at, to examine. I think you have to go back to Oswald himself and how he may have been the person who was potentially set up for this. Well, we know. In fact, a congressman who examined in the 1970s Oswald's background suggested that Oswald had the fingerprints of intelligence all over him, meaning that he did have an intelligence background. There's certainly indication, meaning he was connected to certain intelligence agents. I think and believe honestly that Oswald was a low-level intelligence operative who was handled by multiple agencies. He was probably an FBI informant prior to the assassination. And all these things were covered up afterwards by the Warren Commission. So if we start to ask that question, who killed JFK? That is the ultimate. I've asked that question a lot in my classes and such, and it's not an easy answer. It's an answer we're still trying to understand. But I think we can see the probabilities we can see that those that had most to gain by JFK's death, and maybe the most to lose if he remained as president. And if you start to look at those things, you maybe come to some more better answers about that. And with some of the things you're going to look at today in this presentation, I think you might have a deeper understanding of those possibilities. I can tell you, when we examine some of the things, though, and some of the different theories that folks have came up with, some certainly have better credibility than others, I would say. I think I want to mention a couple things because some of these things have come out even in recent times. For instance, there have been those who've suggested that maybe Russia, the communist regime in the Soviet Union, assassinated JFK. And I just feel like that just doesn't have any weight. It doesn't pass the rational test. Because if you look at JFK and what he was doing prior to the assassination, it was evident and obvious that he was making attempts to bring an end to the Cold War, to have a rapprochement with Russia in the Cold War. And you may know more or less about that, but certainly there were a lot of tensions between us and the Soviet Union. The Bay of Pigs failed invasion, which probably put JFK at odds with him and the CIA in that failed attempt. Cuba, of course, and Castro was a Russian ally 90 miles from our shore. And then the Cuban Missile Crisis, where both countries were at the brink of nuclear war. And I think JFK was, by 1963, was very much determined to bring an end to that, or at least to try to find a way in terms of peace. He talked in terms of peace. His famous and important American University speech in the summer of June 1963, where he talked about that the Soviets are mortal too, that they are human beings, they're to be respected, and that something had to be done to pull us out of this brink of destruction. And it's important to note that the Russians heard that speech. They printed JFK's speech verbatim in their communist-controlled newspapers. They were aware of what he was doing. Then later, in the fall of '63, we actually signed a nuclear test ban treaty with the Soviets. It just doesn't really pass a viable test that maybe the Russians could have been involved with this at a time when JFK was actually reaching out to them for peace. I've spent a lot of time looking at the classified documents that have been released of late, and one of them I came across was a source that we had inside the Kremlin itself in 1967. It was codenamed Shamrock, who suggested that in actuality, the Russians inside the Kremlin actually mourned JFK's death because they felt like he was somebody they could work with for peace. So I think there's a strong indication that just doesn't pass the rational test. And I also think that those that have suggested that maybe Castro, and obviously the communists in Cuba that we were trying to eliminate, may have in a kind of a blowback thing, may have been involved or may have been responsible for JFK's death. But here again, I for some of the same reasons, at the very time that JFK was shot, he had a back channel type of envoy speaking with Castro about the possibility with peace with that country. And that it was mentioned when he found out that JFK was shot, that Castro said, "This is very bad." I just, again, why would Castro, like Russia, risk World War III to assassinate JFK? So I think you can kind of eliminate those two situations. So if not there, then where do we look? And I think there's some things to start with. I think let's take a look at one of the reasons why so many Americans, as I mentioned earlier, were skeptical about what they were told in terms of Lee Harvey Oswald acting alone. And one of those prime things was the fact that a nightclub owner named Jack Ruby, 2 days after the assassination of JFK, walked into the basement of the Dallas jail and shot Lee Harvey Oswald before we could really get to the bottom or find out anything from Oswald what his involvement may have been. To many, it seemed like that this was a process of silencing Oswald, and I thought a lot of Americans just kind of saw that. I mean, whether how much they knew or anything else, it didn't pass the smell test. Let's point out something. Though the Warren Commission suggested that Ruby merely shot Kennedy to spare JFK's wife, Jackie, the going through a trial, that just didn't hold much weight. And they suggested that Ruby had no connections with anybody, but that's just the opposite. Ruby was heavily connected with the mob, who was one of those groups that had an interest maybe in doing something about JFK, because his brother RFK was doing everything he can to basically wipe the mob off the map in the early 1960s. So Ruby's mob connections were very suspicious. And a document that came out just a few years ago, one of the declassified documents where Ruby suggested to an FBI informant the morning of the assassination, and he was going to go watch the fireworks that day, which indicates that Ruby had foreknowledge at the very least of the assassination. And then, of course, he's going to do something about it to eliminate Oswald afterwards. I think another place you could look, as a starting point, and you'll get a lot of things today, I'm sure, that I just want to throw a few things out at you, would be, okay, if Lee Harvey Oswald did not assassinate the president, then how was he maneuvered as to be what he suggested he was, a patsy, a person that was the fall guy, in effect? Who put him in that Texas school book depository in that building in advance as he was working there, so he could be in position to, either be a part of the assassination or be set up? And the answer to that question, the owner of the Texas School Book Depository was D.H. Byrd. Byrd is the one who in effect, hired Oswald. So what kind of connections were there with Byrd to other folks? And you see a lot of things. I mean, some people, a friend of mine is expert on the assassination in Dallas, and of course the scene in Texas, talked about that there's so many connections with so many people who may have known each other. Well, D.H. Byrd, the man who hired Oswald, was closely connected, was a business crony of Lyndon Johnson. He was who probably benefited as much as anybody by the assassination. He was friendly with, and even on a hunting trip with Curtis not Curtis LeMay, I got that backwards, but he was a good associate, close associate with Curtis LeMay, who was in the Joint Chiefs of Staff and one of the real anti-communist extremists who had an extreme hatred for Kennedy. He was connected to many of the Texas oil people whose oil depletion allowance that JFK was threatening to end, and who had extreme right-wing views as well, who had a hatred for Kennedy and controlled the scenes in Dallas. D.H. Byrd actually started the Civil Air Patrol, where Lee Harvey Oswald was connected with as a young man. So you see, just by looking at one aspect of this, how different things reach out in different directions. And I think that's probably an indication as we look at the assassination. I mean, a lot of folks try to point the finger in one direction and talk about the CIA, or talk about the mob, or the military-industrial complex, and I think it's probably or folks in Texas, and I think it's probably a mistake to make a presumption that if we get past the idea that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone, and if we look at the fact that JFK, in so many ways, challenged the power structure in America, and people who had an agenda to potentially uh, have a desire to eliminate Kennedy for whatever motives. If we look at that in those directions, it's probably better understanding to maybe look at this as more as a collaboration of people that who are in powerful positions, could have been in a position to either uh, uh, orchestrate events beforehand in the assassination, but also very important, who was in a position to orchestrate a cover-up afterwards. The creation of the Warren Commission, the control of the FBI and J. Edgar Hoover, and controlling and even destroying evidence. The autopsy, which is so controversial, which some people suggest is the best evidence of JFK in his wounds. Who could have been in position before and afterwards to create these events, to eliminate the protection of the president and make it so where the Secret Service was not where they were supposed to be in protecting the president? You've got to ask those questions, I think, and probably when you do, you're probably seeing a high level of power there. So I think those are things to consider. That you didn't. It doesn't mean that everybody in America or everybody in the CIA, who certainly had an agenda and possibility of because JFK actually threatened to scatter them in 1,000 pieces after the Bay of Pigs debacle that they were a part of. It would be a mistake to just say everyone in a particular agency, the mob or the CIA. You only needed critical people in critical positions, I think, to manipulate and carry out this incident. Now, let's talk about conspiracy a little bit, because, of course, in many ways, conspiracy has come to be kind of a little bit of a dirty word, and we think of baseless, far-fetched theories that people concoct, or in today's world like QAnon or election deniers, or people, the folks that seem to be on the extreme, that believe in stuff that doesn't have much basis in fact. And that it's dangerous for folks to do that and go in those directions. But I think it's also dangerous to dismiss everything, every potential conspiracy, as just a fantasy. I think that what separates maybe the JFK assassination for some of those other things that folks might choose to embrace in today's world is that there are real facts of conspiracy on the ground. There were folks that had real motives, evidence that seems to indicate and point in different directions besides Oswald. And I think those are the things that we need to focus on. And I feel like it is really important. I want to bring my little talk to a close by suggesting and talking about what the importance and relevance of the JFK assassination. Why are we still looking at almost 60 years later? Why is it still important? And I think that something that's really important to me as a historian is that it's really important to get our history right, and especially in an open democracy that we believe in. And I believe the JFK assassination badly damaged but did not destroy our democracy. We still have some things in place, but if we don't get our history correct, if we don't have openness and truth in a free society, it endangers that very society. And so it's always important to get our history correct and pursue it, even if many of those same institutions reject that notion. I think when many of you as students look at your textbooks, and you'll see, and there'll be things that you look at the JFK assassination in your history textbooks, and for the most part, they'll talk about Lee Harvey Oswald. In fact, I just looked at my textbook again, the one I teach in my history class, and it describes Oswald as a mysterious figure and has a sort of vagueness to it. Others just go along with the Warren Commission opinion that Oswald acted alone, and that's that. And I think that's just a complete falsehood of history that has to be corrected. And if it's not corrected, by my generation. In the years to come, maybe it will be by yours. But I hope you've enjoyed my talk today, and I hope this is a good start for you as you go forward. You're going to look at some good discussions from experts, some good films. I'll be back later on at the end of this to answer any potential questions. And again, I hope you enjoy the day, and I hope it's very informative to you, and you'll find some things out about this maybe that you didn't know or aware of, and maybe lead to some more investigation on your part. So have a good day. Enjoy the forum, and hope to see you afterwards. Thank you very much.